It was 2012, and I was 27 years old when I took a night shift security job in the middle of nowhere in Queensland, Australia. The company I worked for had contracts with remote properties, and this one was particularly isolated, a cabin used by a mining company to store equipment and documents. It sat at the edge of dense bushland, miles from the nearest town. The job was simple: stay overnight, keep an eye on the cabin, and report any unusual activity. The drive there was uneventful, but as the dirt road stretched farther into the wilderness, I began to feel the weight of the isolation. The cabin itself was basic, a single-story wooden structure with a tin roof, surrounded by a small clearing. Behind it, the bush seemed impenetrable, with towering gum trees and thick undergrowth. A chain-link fence encircled the cabin, and there were floodlights mounted at each corner, though they only lit up the immediate area. Beyond that, the darkness was absolute. I parked my car near the entrance and stepped out. The air was thick and humid, buzzing with the sound of cicadas. As I walked toward the cabin, the gravel crunched under my boots, loud in the stillness. The cabin smelled faintly of mildew when I entered. The interior was sparse: a desk with a chair, a small kitchenette, a cot in the corner, and a row of filing cabinets along one wall. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead. I checked the security cameras, 4 of them covering the perimeter. Everything seemed quiet. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I made a pot of instant coffee and settled into the chair, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. The signal was weak, but it was enough to keep me distracted. Outside, the floodlights cast long shadows on the ground, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness beyond them was pressing closer. Around midnight, I decided to stretch my legs. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cooler now, and the sounds of the night had changed. The cicadas were quieter, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I walked the perimeter, shining the beam of my flashlight along the fence line. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. Back inside, I locked the door and returned to the monitors. The cameras showed the same scenes: the front gate, the rear fence, the side of the cabin, and the clearing beyond. Still, the unease lingered. I told myself it was just nerves. It was my first time working alone in such an isolated place, after all. At around 2 a.m., something caught my eye on the monitor. The feed from the rear camera flickered for a moment before going black. I leaned forward, trying to see if it would come back. Didn't. I checked the other cameras. They were still working. The rational part of me thought it might just be a technical glitch, but I couldn't ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I grabbed my flashlight again and went outside to check the camera. As I walked toward the rear fence, the beam of light seemed to shrink against the darkness. The bush behind the cabin was dense, the trees casting tangled shadows. When I reached the camera, I saw it had been ripped from its mount, the wires dangling like exposed nerves. My skin prickled. It wasn't the kind of damage an animal could do. It looked deliberate. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness. The bush was still, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. My heart was pounding as I turned and hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I sat at the desk, staring at the monitors. The remaining cameras showed nothing unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. An hour passed, then another. I forced myself to stay alert, sipping stale coffee and glancing at the screens every few seconds. Just as I started to think I might be imagining things, I heard it, a faint sound coming from the back of the cabin. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking gently on the wall. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the back door, my hands shaking. The sound stopped as I approached. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and stepping outside. The air was cold now, and the bush seemed unnaturally quiet. I shone the flashlight along the back wall, but there was nothing there. No one. As I turned to go back inside, the beam of light caught something on the ground. It was a footprint pressed into the soft dirt near the wall. It was fresh, and it wasn't mine. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Who could be out here, miles from anywhere, in the middle of the night? I locked the door and checked the cameras again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint movement at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the floodlights. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I stared at the monitor, willing the figure to step into the light, but it stayed just out of reach. The next few hours were a blur of tension. The figure never came closer, but it also never left. It stayed at the edge of the clearing, a dark silhouette against the trees. The tapping started again, this time on the side of the cabin. Then the front. It was as if whoever or whatever it was testing me, trying to gauge my reaction. By dawn, the activity stopped. The cameras showed an empty clearing, and the tapping had ceased. When the relief crew arrived, I was too shaken to explain what had happened. I simply packed my things and left, driving away as fast as I could. I never went back to that cabin. Months later, I heard rumors about people disappearing in the area. Their belongings found abandoned, but no trace of them. I still don't know who or what was out there that night, but the memory of those footsteps, those knocks, still haunts me. Every time I hear a tap at night, I can't help but wonder if it's starting all over again. I didn't mean to stop at the cabin. It was late October, and I had been hiking for hours, hoping to reach a campsite before dark. I'd misjudged how long the trail would take, and by the time I realized I wouldn't make it, I was already too deep in the woods. The wind had picked up, sharp and cold, and the daylight was fading fast. I was alone, miles from any road, and the only shelter I could find was the small, crumbling cabin off the trail. I almost didn't go inside. It looked like the kind of place where trouble starts. The roof sagged in the middle, one window was shattered, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges. I stood there for a while, staring at it, weighing my options. Staying outside didn't feel safe. The wind cut right through my jacket, and I'd started to shiver. If I stayed out, I'd spend the night exposed to the elements, and I wasn't sure my body could take that. The cabin seemed better than nothing. At least it had walls. I told myself it was just for one night. I'd get up at first light and keep moving. I stepped up onto the porch, my boots crunching on the warped wooden boards. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound loud in the quiet woods. Inside, the air smelled stale, like damp wood and old dirt. The floor was littered with leaves and broken glass. The only light came from the last scraps of daylight leaking through the cracked window. There was a single room, empty except for a rusted metal cot shoved against one wall. The mattress was long gone, leaving just a bare, spring-covered frame. I set my pack down in the corner, trying to ignore how the place made me feel. There was something off about it, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe it was the silence. The woods were usually full of sound, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves. But here, it was dead quiet. Even the wind outside seemed muffled. I told myself I was imagining things. I was tired, cold, and hungry. My mind was playing tricks on me. I unrolled my sleeping bag and spread it out on the floor, as far from the cot as I could get. I didn't like the look of it, sitting there in the corner like it was waiting for someone. As the light faded, the cabin grew darker and darker until I could barely see. I didn't want to burn through my flashlight batteries, so I used it sparingly, eating a quick meal from my pack and then settling into my sleeping bag. I figured if I could just get some sleep, morning would come faster. But sleep didn't come. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to the silence. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the wind pushing against the cabin walls, the rustle of leaves outside. My imagination was running wild, filling the darkness with shapes and shadows. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I remember was waking up to a noise. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic thumping. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to figure out what it was. It sounded like it was coming from outside, near the back of the cabin. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then the sound changed. It wasn't random anymore. It was steady, deliberate, like someone was knocking. I sat up, my heart pounding. The thumping stopped. For a moment, the silence was so heavy I thought I might have imagined it. But then it started again, louder this time, like whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to hear it. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the back wall. The beam lit up the inside of the cabin, but the noise stopped again. I stayed frozen, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The silence stretched on, and I started to wonder if I should go outside to check. But something deep in my gut told me not to. Minutes passed, and then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and heavy, crunching on the leaves outside. They circled the cabin, moving deliberately, pausing every few steps. My chest tightened, and I felt my breathing grow shallow. This wasn't an animal. Someone was out there. I stayed as quiet as I could, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps stopped at the front door. I waited, expecting the door to creak open, but nothing happened. The silence dragged on, and then, just as I started to think they'd left, I heard a low, raspy breathing. It was close, just on the other side of the door. My mind raced. Should I run? Should I try to fight? I wasn't sure I could take whoever was out there, but staying put felt just as dangerous. My heart hammered in my chest as I weighed my options. And then suddenly the door creaked. It didn't open all the way, just enough for me to see a shadowy figure standing there. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a man, tall and broad-shouldered. He didn't move. He just stood there, breathing. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I grabbed my pack and bolted out the back window, not caring about the glass that scratched my hands and knees as I scrambled through. I hit the ground running, my flashlight bouncing wildly in the dark. I ran until my lungs burned, and I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own footsteps. When I finally stopped, I was deep in the woods, far from the cabin. I collapsed against a tree, trying to catch my breath, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. I didn't see him again, but I didn't go back for my sleeping bag either. I hiked through the night, using my flashlight sparingly, my ears straining for any sound. When the sun finally rose, I felt like I could breathe again. It wasn't until I reached a ranger station later that morning that I realized how lucky I'd been. The rangers told me that the cabin wasn't on any map. It wasn't part of the park. No one knew who built it or why it was there, but they'd found evidence in the past, bits of clothing, abandoned gear, that suggested I wasn't the first hiker to cross paths with the man in the cabin. They never caught him, and I never went hiking alone again. It was late September, and the air had just begun to take on the crispness of fall. My wife, Emily, and I were invited to spend a weekend at a cabin with her sister, Megan, and Megan's husband, Brian. They had recently bought the place, a secluded log cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan, as a weekend retreat. They were excited to show it off, and we hadn't had a chance to visit since they purchased it earlier in the year. The drive out there was long and winding, taking us further and further from any sign of civilization. By the time we reached the cabin, dusk had already begun to settle over the forest. The place was beautiful, though. An A-frame cabin with large windows that faced a serene lake, its surface reflecting the fiery orange and red hues of the sunset. Brian and Megan were standing on the porch, waving as we pulled into the gravel driveway. The first evening was uneventful. We had a simple dinner, laughed over a few drinks, and talked about everything from work to family to random memories from the past. The cabin was cozy, with rustic wooden furniture, a stone fireplace, and thick rugs that muffled the sound of footsteps. Outside, the woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a loon from the lake. After a long drive and a full stomach, I was ready to crash. Emily and I took the guest room downstairs while Megan and Brian stayed in the master bedroom upstairs. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sound of the wind through the trees. The first strange thing happened early the next morning. I woke up to find the guest room window wide open, even though I was sure I'd closed it the night before. The air in the room was freezing, and a damp, earthy smell wafted in from outside. Emily was still asleep, so I quietly shut the window and locked it. I didn't think much of it. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly, and the wind had blown it open. Brian and Megan were already awake when we came upstairs for breakfast. Brian was frying eggs on the stove while Megan brewed coffee. They seemed cheerful and relaxed, and the smell of food and fresh coffee helped me shake off the unease from earlier. After breakfast, we decided to explore the property. Brian was eager to show off the trails he'd cleared through the woods and a small dock he'd built on the lake. The four of us spent the day hiking, fishing, and even paddling out onto the lake in a canoe Brian had brought along. By the time we got back to the cabin, the sun was dipping low in the sky, and the air had turned chilly. That night, things got stranger. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were deliberate, slow, and heavy, like a person trying to move quietly. I nudged Emily awake, but she mumbled something and rolled over. I got out of bed and crept to the window, careful not to make any noise. Peeking through the curtains, I saw nothing but darkness. The footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The next morning, I mentioned it to Brian and Megan over breakfast. Megan shrugged it off, saying the woods could play tricks on you, especially at night. Brian joked that maybe it was a bear, though his tone didn't seem entirely convincing. Emily didn't say much, but I could tell she was uneasy. The following day was overcast and colder. We spent most of the day indoors, playing board games and watching old movies on a small TV. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed up to read. The fire had burned down to embers, and the only light in the room came from the dim glow of a lamp on the side table. I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were closer, circling the cabin. My heart began to pound as I strained to listen. Suddenly, there was a soft thud against the wall, just outside the living room. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it might as well have been a gunshot. I turned off the lamp and crouched by the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest was silent, the shadows long and distorted in the moonlight. I couldn't see anyone or anything. The sound stopped after a while, and I eventually went to bed, though I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I decided to check around the cabin. I didn't want to alarm anyone, so I waited until Emily, Megan, and Brian were busy inside. I walked around the perimeter, looking for footprints or any sign of what might have caused the noise. Near the back of the cabin, I found something, a small, worn path leading into the woods. It wasn't one of the trails Brian had shown us. This one was narrow and overgrown, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why hadn't Brian mentioned this trail? Or had he not noticed it? Either way, I decided not to say anything for now. I didn't want to ruin the weekend with my growing paranoia. That night was the worst. The footsteps came back, louder and more persistent. This time, they were accompanied by faint scratching sounds at the windows. Everyone heard it. Brian grabbed a flashlight and opened the front door, shining the beam into the darkness. The woods swallowed the light, and nothing moved. We stayed up for hours, too tense to sleep. Around 4 a.m., the noises stopped. When dawn finally broke, we decided to pack up and leave. As we loaded the car, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible through the trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I could tell by the look on Emily's face that she'd seen it too. We never went back. Megan and Brian eventually sold the cabin, claiming it was too remote for their liking. We never talked about what happened that weekend, but I still think about it sometimes. About the footsteps, the strange path, and the figure in the woods. And I always wonder if we were being watched the whole time, or if we were being hunted. The year was 2013, and I was 28 years old. My brother, Ryan, was a 32-year-old police officer with a reputation for being one of the best in the department. He had always been the responsible one, the kind of guy who did everything by the book, which made him perfect for his line of work. I worked as a graphic designer, the complete opposite of Ryan's job. I always admired his courage, even if I thought he could be a little too rigid at times. One winter day, he called me out of the blue and asked if I could help him with something important. He told me to pack enough clothes for a few days, some sturdy boots, and anything I might need for roughing it in the woods. He wouldn't give me any details over the phone, but promised to explain everything once we met. Knowing Ryan, I didn't ask too many questions. The next morning, I drove out to the small town of Brookhaven, nestled in the foothills of Washington State. Ryan met me at a gas station on the edge of town. He wasn't in uniform, which was unusual for him, but he still had the same serious look on his face. He asked me to follow him in my car as we headed deep into the forest. We drove for over an hour on winding dirt roads. The trees grew denser, the air colder, and the sky darker as thick clouds rolled in. Finally, Ryan stopped his truck in front of a small, weathered cabin that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The place was isolated, no cell service, no neighbors, just miles of forest in every direction. "This is where we'll be staying," Ryan said as he unloaded his gear. I noticed he had brought a large duffel bag, a rifle, and what looked like tactical equipment. That's when it hit me this wasn't a casual camping trip. Ryan finally explained why we were here. He'd been working on a case involving a drug trafficking ring operating in the area. The suspects had been using remote cabins like this one to stash their supplies and avoid detection. His team had raided several locations, but one key player had escaped, a man named Derek Mills, a violent fugitive with a history of evading law enforcement. Ryan's department suspected Mills might return to this particular cabin, and Ryan had volunteered to stake it out. I asked why he needed me. He said he couldn't involve any other officers because the department didn't have the resources to send backup for such a remote location. He needed someone he could trust to watch his back. That didn't exactly put me at ease, but I didn't want to let him down. We settled into the cabin, which was as rough as it looked. The inside was bare bones. A couple of old cots, a rusted wood stove, and a table covered in dust. There was no electricity, and the only source of light was an oil lantern Ryan had brought. The place smelled of mildew, and the air was damp and cold. Ryan set up his gear, which included surveillance equipment and a police radio. He showed me how to use a pair of binoculars and a basic first aid kit just in case. I wasn't sure what I'd signed up for, but I trusted Ryan. The first night was uneventful. We took turns keeping watch, one of us sitting by the window while the other tried to get some sleep. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. By the second day, I was starting to feel the weight of the situation. Ryan's seriousness didn't help. He rarely spoke, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. He told me Mills was dangerous and had a history of ambushing officers who underestimated him. That afternoon, while Ryan was outside checking the perimeter, I heard a strange noise. Faint footsteps, almost imperceptible, coming from the woods behind the cabin. My heart raced as I grabbed the binoculars and peered through the window. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a flash of movement, a figure darting between the trees. When Ryan came back inside, I told him what I'd seen. His face hardened, and he immediately checked his rifle. He told me to stay inside while he went out to investigate. I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told me not to. He was gone for nearly an hour. Each minute felt like an eternity. I sat by the window, clutching the binoculars, straining to see or hear anything. When he finally returned, he said he hadn't found anyone, but saw signs that someone had been nearby. Fresh footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin. That night, we doubled our watch shifts. The temperature dropped below freezing, and the wind howled through the trees, making it even harder to focus. Around midnight, I heard it again. Those faint footsteps, this time closer. I nudged Ryan awake, and he grabbed his rifle. We both stared out the window, scanning the darkness. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the side of the cabin, followed by silence. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Ryan motioned for me to stay low as he crept toward the door. He opened it just enough to peek outside but didn't step out. After a few tense moments, he closed the door and whispered that there was nothing there. The next day, we found deep scratches on the cabin's wooden walls, as if someone or something had been clawing at it. Ryan dismissed it as an animal, but I wasn't so sure. The marks were too deliberate, too menacing. By the fourth day, we were both on edge. The food we'd brought was running low, and the isolation was starting to get to me. Ryan, however, seemed even more focused. He was convinced Mills was nearby, waiting for the right moment to strike. That evening, as the sun set and the forest plunged into darkness, the tension became unbearable. Ryan set up a tripwire connected to a flare around the cabin's perimeter, hoping to catch Mills off guard. Around 3 a.m., the flare went off. The cabin lit up in a burst of red light, and Ryan grabbed his rifle. He motioned for me to stay put as he stepped outside. Through the window, I saw him moving cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Then I heard it, a gunshot followed by a second. My stomach dropped as I rushed to the window, desperate to see what was happening. Ryan was running back toward the cabin, shouting for me to lock the door. He burst inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. He told me Mills had been out there, armed, and that he'd managed to wound him, but Mills had escaped into the woods. For the rest of the night, we stayed alert, listening for any sign of movement. The hours dragged on, the cabin's walls feeling more like a prison than a shelter. At dawn, Ryan decided it was too dangerous to stay. He radioed for backup, but the signal was weak. He told me to pack up our gear while he kept watch. As we were loading the truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold: Mills's footprints, leading right up to the cabin's back door. He had been here watching us, possibly even listening to us. And now he was out there, wounded but still dangerous. As we drove away, the forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing longer with each mile. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mills was still out there, watching, waiting for his next move. Ryan didn't say much on the drive back, but his silence spoke volumes. This wasn't over, not for him, not for me. Mills was still out there, and I knew Ryan wouldn't rest until he was caught. That night, as I lay in bed back home, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside made my heart race. I realized then that the real terror wasn't just in the forest. It was knowing that someone like Mills could be out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The cabin had been my wife's favorite place. Nestled deep in the forests of Maine, it was where we spent summers, birthdays, and countless quiet weekends away from the chaos of life. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden structure with 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a porch that faced a lake. But it was hers, and by extension, it became mine. After she passed away 2 years ago, I stopped going. The memories were too strong. I couldn't sit on that porch without hearing her laugh, without seeing her curled up in her favorite chair with a book. I couldn't walk by the lake without imagining her skipping stones or pointing out some birds she'd spotted. The cabin felt like her, and her absence turned it into a painful reminder. But now, at 42, I felt I had to go back. It wasn't a sudden decision. My therapist had been encouraging me for months to confront the grief head-on, to reclaim the things that once brought joy. The cabin doesn't have to be a monument to her absence, she said. It can still be a place of peace. I finally agreed. It was mid-October when I packed my truck with supplies, food, clothes, firewood, and a rifle for safety. The drive took about 5 hours. The road narrowed as I got closer, the trees growing thicker, their leaves a mix of fiery reds and oranges. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked the same. The porch sagged slightly, the paint on the door was peeling, and the chimney was speckled with moss. But it stood there, sturdy and quiet, as if waiting for me. I parked the truck and unloaded my gear. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine and damp earth. Inside, the cabin smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. I opened the windows and swept away the cobwebs while the fire in the old stone fireplace began to crackle. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The silence was oppressive. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of leaves outside, made me tense. I wasn't used to being alone in a place so remote. Still, I stayed. The next day, I decided to keep busy. I chopped wood, cleaned out the gutters, and repaired a loose step on the porch. As the sun climbed higher, I ventured down to the lake. The water was colder than I remembered, and the forest seemed thicker, wilder. It was late afternoon when I noticed something strange. About 200 yards from the cabin, in a patch of trees near the edge of the property, I saw a rope tied to a branch. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. It looked old, frayed, and weathered, as if it had been there for years. But I knew it hadn't. I walked over to investigate. The rope was tied in a loop, hanging from a low branch. Beneath it, the ground was bare, as if something heavy had been dragged away. My chest tightened. Could have been kids messing around or a hunter leaving a snare. Still, it unsettled me. That night, I locked the doors and kept the rifle within arm's reach. Over the next few days, more things began to feel off. I'd wake up and find the cabin colder than it should have been, even with the fire going all night. I found footprints near the back door, too large to be mine, pressed into the damp soil. One afternoon, I came back from the lake and found the porch light on. I hadn't turned it on. By the 5th day, I was on edge. The peace I'd come to find had turned into a gnawing paranoia. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was projecting my grief and fear onto the place. But deep down, I didn't believe it. That night, I sat in the living room, staring at the fire. The rifle was propped against the couch. Outside, the wind howled, making the trees sway and groan. I was about to head to bed when I heard it, a soft knock at the back door. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I grabbed the rifle and crept toward the door. Through the small window, I couldn't see anything. I swung the door open, aiming the rifle at nothing but darkness. The forest was silent. I shut the door, bolted it, and stayed up the rest of the night, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, loading them into the truck. As I went to grab the last bag, I saw something on the porch, a single muddy handprint smeared across the railing. I didn't stop to think. I threw the bag into the truck and sped down the dirt road, the cabin growing smaller in the rearview mirror. When I got back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. I checked the locks on every door and window twice before going to bed. Weeks passed, but I couldn't forget the cabin. I considered selling it, but couldn't bring myself to let it go. It wasn't just hers, it was ours. But I knew I couldn't go back, not alone. Last week, I got a call from the sheriff's office in the nearest town. A couple of hikers had gone missing near the area. They'd found their car parked on the main road, but no sign of them in the woods. I didn't tell them about the rope or the handprint. I didn't mention the knock at the door or the footprints behind the cabin. But I couldn't help wondering if they were connected. Now, every night I dream of the cabin. I see the rope swaying in the wind, the muddy handprint on the railing, and the dark forest beyond. I wonder if it's still waiting for me, if whatever was out there is still watching, still lurking. And I wonder if I'll ever be able to let it go, or if it will let me. When I decided to take my dog, Scout, on a solo trip to a remote cabin in northern Minnesota, I thought it'd be a perfect way to escape the noise of daily life. It was early October 2023, and the leaves were bursting with shades of orange, red, and gold. I'd rented the cabin online, charmed by the idea of being surrounded by nothing but nature. It was advertised as a secluded, off-grid retreat. No Wi-Fi, no cell service. Just me, Scout, and the woods. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from Duluth, where I'd landed after a short flight from Chicago. I'd rented a beat-up Jeep at the airport, perfect for the rough, gravel roads that would lead me to the cabin. Scout, a loyal German Shepherd mix, sat in the back seat, his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. As we drove deeper into the woods, the roads narrowed, and the trees grew denser. Eventually, the GPS lost signal, and I had to rely on the printed directions the cabin owner had emailed me. After a series of wrong turns and some nervous backtracking, I finally found the driveway, a barely visible dirt path marked by a weathered wooden sign that read Havenwood. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, with a pitched roof, a small porch, and large windows that looked out onto a quiet lake. It was surrounded by towering pines and birches, their reflections rippling on the water. Inside, there was a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a propane stove, and a single bedroom with a creaky wooden bed. A stack of firewood was piled outside, and a lantern hung by the door. After unpacking, I took Scout for a walk along the lake's edge. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the water. Scout sniffed everything, his tail wagging happily. Felt peaceful, like I'd stepped into another world. That first night, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal on the stove. Scout curled up by the fireplace, his eyes half closed but his ears twitching at every small sound. Outside, the woods were pitch black, and the silence was so complete it was almost unnerving. I tried to ignore the slight unease that crept over me as I locked the cabin door before bed. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore the trails around the property. The cabin came with a hand-drawn map of the area, showing a network of hiking paths that wound through the woods. I packed a small backpack with water and snacks, leashed Scout, and set off. The trails were faint, barely more than animal paths in some places, but the map was clear enough. We walked for hours, enjoying the cool air and the vibrant autumn colors. Scout stayed close, his nose to the ground, occasionally barking at squirrels that darted up the trees. Around midday, I realized we'd gone farther than I'd planned. The trail had become harder to follow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't anything obvious, just a sense of unease, like the forest was holding its breath. Scout seemed to sense it too. He kept stopping, his ears perked up, staring into the trees. But whenever I looked, there was nothing there. I decided it was time to head back. But retracing our steps wasn't as easy as I'd hoped. The forest looked different, and I couldn't find the landmarks I'd noted earlier. The more I tried to orient myself, the more turned around I became. Scout started growling low in his throat, his body tense. It wasn't like him to act that way. I gripped his leash tighter and tried to stay calm. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the last thing I needed was to panic. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled back onto the trail. I almost cried with relief when I saw the cabin through the trees. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but at least we were safe. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Scout, usually full of energy, seemed restless. He paced the cabin, whining occasionally, and refused to settle down. I chalked it up to our long hike and tried to ignore it. As night fell, the woods came alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch. I told myself it was normal, just the sounds of nature, but it felt wrong, like there was something more out there. I tried to sleep, but Scout wouldn't stay quiet. Around midnight, he started barking. A deep, frantic bark that made my heart race. He was standing by the window, staring into the darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it outside, but all I saw were trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, I found footprints near the cabin. Not animal tracks, human ones. They were faint, but unmistakable, leading from the edge of the woods to the porch and back again. I tried to convince myself they were mine, even though I knew they weren't. I hadn't gone near that part of the woods. Scout seemed on edge all day. He refused to leave my side, growling softly whenever we got near the tree line. I decided to stay close to the cabin, venturing only as far as the lake to fetch water. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and kept my flashlight within reach. I didn't sleep much, listening to every creak and rustle outside. Scout lay by the door, his ears alert, growling softly whenever he heard a noise. The following day, I noticed something even more disturbing. The firewood pile had been moved. It wasn't a huge shift, but enough to make me uneasy. Someone or something had been near the cabin while I slept. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bags, loaded them into the Jeep, and prepared to leave. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, but it wouldn't start. Panic set in. I was miles from the nearest town with no cell service and no way to contact anyone. The cabin didn't have a phone, and I hadn't seen another person since I'd arrived. I spent the day trying to fix the Jeep, but I didn't know much about cars. By evening, I was exhausted and no closer to a solution. That night, the sounds outside grew louder. Footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. Scout barked furiously, his body pressed against the door. I held a kitchen knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, my heart pounding. When morning came, I found more footprints, closer this time. Whoever or whatever it was, they were toying with me. By the fourth night, I was at my breaking point. I hadn't slept in days, and the constant fear was wearing me down. Scout was equally tense, barking at every little noise. I decided to stay awake all night, sitting by the door with the knife and flashlight. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, closer than ever. They stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my hand hurt. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, a single knock echoed through the cabin. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time, and then nothing. When dawn broke, I cautiously opened the door. The footprints were there, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. I didn't wait to find out who or what had been tormenting me. I gathered my things, put Scout on a leash, and started walking. It took me nearly the entire day to reach a main road, where a passing car finally stopped to help. To this day, I don't know who was out there. The cabin owner claimed not to know anything, and the local authorities found no evidence of foul play. But I know what I felt. I know the fear that gripped me as I sat in that cabin, waiting for something or someone to make their move. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. I'll never forget the summer I spent at my grandmother's cabin. I was 24, trying to save money and figure out my next step in life. My grandma, who'd passed away 2 years earlier, had left behind a cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods and a small family graveyard that dated back to the 1800s. The cabin had been abandoned since her death. My family couldn't agree on what to do with it. Some wanted to sell, others wanted to keep it for sentimental reasons. In the meantime, it just sat there, falling apart slowly. When my mom suggested I spend a couple of weeks there to clear my head, I figured it couldn't hurt. The cabin was in the Appalachian foothills, near a forgotten town called Mountain Hollow. It was about a 4-hour drive from where I lived. I loaded my car with the essentials: canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a few basic tools. The drive up was uneventful, but as I got closer, the roads became narrower, the trees denser. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sky was heavy with gray clouds. The cabin looked worse than I remembered. The roof sagged in places, and the wood siding was warped and peeling. A rickety porch wrapped around the front, with a pair of rocking chairs that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Behind the cabin, a narrow path led to the graveyard, hidden by thick underbrush. I unloaded my car and stepped inside. The air was stale, smelling of wood rot and mildew. The furniture was covered in sheets, and dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. I spent the first couple of hours sweeping, wiping down surfaces, and airing the place out. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, and the cabin felt a little less oppressive. I set up a small gas-powered generator I'd brought for power. It gave me enough electricity for lights and to charge my phone, though I had no cell service this far out. I cooked some canned soup for dinner and settled into one of the old armchairs, listening to the hum of insects outside. The first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and woke up early the next morning, eager to explore. I decided to check out the graveyard first. The path was overgrown, branches snagging at my clothes as I pushed through. The graveyard itself was small, maybe a dozen headstones, most of them worn and leaning. I recognized a few names from old family stories. My grandma was buried there, next to my grandpa and a few great-grandparents I'd only heard about in passing. As I stood there, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves. It felt colder than it should have been for late June. I brushed it off and spent the rest of the day cleaning the cabin and chopping wood for the fireplace. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin was dead silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. I chalked it up to my imagination and forced myself to sleep. Over the next few days, the uneasy feeling grew. I started noticing small things. A chair slightly out of place, a door I was sure I'd closed standing open, faint scuff marks on the wooden floor that hadn't been there before. The graveyard also seemed different. Each time I visited, I felt like the headstones were shifting ever so slightly, though I couldn't prove it. I took photos with my phone, hoping to compare them later, but the images always looked the same. By the 5th day, I was ready to leave. I'd had enough of the isolation and the strange occurrences. But when I tried to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything I could think of, but it was dead. I decided to hike into town to find help. Mountain Hollow was about 5 miles away, but I figured I could make it there and back before dark. I packed a bag with water and a flashlight and set off. The woods were dense, the path barely visible in some places. About halfway there, I heard something behind me, soft footsteps, just far enough back that I couldn't see who or what was making them. I stopped, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped too. I called out, hoping it was a hiker or maybe a hunter, but no one answered. The rest of the hike was a blur. I walked as fast as I could without breaking into a full sprint, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I reached the town, breathless and on edge, but it was practically deserted. Most of the buildings were boarded up, and the few people I saw avoided eye contact. I finally found an old gas station with a payphone. The man behind the counter was polite but distant, saying he couldn't leave the station to help with my car. I called a tow truck, but they told me it would be at least 2 days before they could get to me. Defeated, I bought some supplies and started the long walk back. The sun was setting as I reached the cabin. The woods were even darker than before, and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. When I stepped inside, I knew immediately something was wrong. The furniture was rearranged. The dust I'd cleared earlier had returned, and the smell of mildew was stronger than ever. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had gotten in, or I was remembering things wrong. But deep down, I knew neither explanation made sense. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made my heart race. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, clutching the flashlight like it was a weapon, until the first light of dawn. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the porch was empty, but the rocking chair was moving slightly, as if someone had just stood up from it. The next 2 days were a nightmare. I didn't eat, barely drank water. I just sat in the cabin, waiting for the tow truck to arrive. The footsteps on the porch came every night, always around 3 a.m., and always stopping just as the sun came up. When the tow truck finally arrived, I practically ran to meet it. The driver didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any answers. I never went back to that cabin. My family eventually sold it, and I don't know what happened to it after that. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear faint footsteps outside my apartment window, pacing back and forth.